All right, so this is the Trinity from Genesis to Revelation. I'm sure you've all heard something contrary to the Trinity as a biblically revealed truth. This takes various forms, but a very common form of attack is to say the Trinity was invented at Nicaea. So this places the revelation of the Trinity, well, it's not a revelation in this case. If it's generated by Nicaea, it would be the product of a council that is itself of dubious distinction in the eyes of those who are laying it at their feet. So that's a very common claim. And that's just one thing that gets dumped on Nicaea. You might have heard the canon was invented at Nicaea. Anything that people don't like, they often write off on Nicaea. And the fact is, most people haven't even read what took place at the council. It's not that there's not ample material. There's stuff out there you could do that. You'll never find anything about what books belong in the canon. That sort of thing is not what's taking place. Nor will you find them saying, let's come up with a new doctrine of God. The whole reason the council was convened is because a presbyter, a preacher in Bacchus of Alexandria, was speaking against what was being taught throughout the church in Alexandria, and in particular, what he was hearing from the bishop of Alexandria. So at this point in church history, a new office had developed, and we can question that, but the bishopric in the Bible, a bishop and a presbyter, they're just two terms for the same thing. They just refer to the different functions that this person has. But in time, it developed where you'd get in a region, a bishop would be over a group of pastors. And so Alexander, in this context, was the bishop in Alexandria. And one of his parish preachers was contesting what he was saying. And so this is why the council was convened. Arius was causing trouble, so the council was convened to discuss this matter and resolve it. And the fact is, there was hardly any debate over Arianism itself. Everybody at the council roundly condemned Arianism. The real question the council had to decide on was, how do we articulate this? Because number one, the way they chose was itself potentially somebody could misuse this. What they said is the Father, Son, and Spirit are one in essence and distinct in person, or one substance. Well, this language was used earlier by the modalists, who were also rebelling against what the church was teaching. And so they were put down, but that was almost entirely without a council. There certainly wasn't an ecumenical council. It was refuted and went the way of all the earth. But in this case, when they're trying to articulate the Trinity, they were looking for a word that they could use that would make it clear that we're not affirming Arianism, but they didn't want to affirm some other heresy. And so they chose a term that had been used earlier by modalists, but they just carefully defined how they were using it. The modalists would say the persons are one substance, but also that each mode is just a distinct and not a personal mode. Anyways, this is not a talk so much about Nicaea. I'm just getting you into this frame of mind where the Trinity is called into question, and a lot of people will push it right out of the Bible. Now, there are others who might admit it to an extent in the Bible. You'll get people who will say things like, well, okay, Paul taught it. It's introduced by Paul, so Paul is the boogeyman. Paul is innovating. He's at odds with the apostolate, the apostles of Christ, and he's the one who's responsible for this. And it's the same scenario. He's not just responsible for this that we don't like. He's responsible for that we don't like, whatever it is. If you don't like his view on the law, you say it's simply Paul's view, and so on and so forth. Well, Christians, of course, aren't going to take that position, but neither are those who are ostensibly Christian, pseudo-Christian cults like Jehovah's Witnesses or Mormons who want to pretend they believe the Bible, they believe the New Testament. And so typically they'll just say, well, it's not found there at all. Not even Paul teaches it. They're in the camp that says this is an innovation at Nicaea. But you will get people, even Christians, fellow brothers and sisters, who will say the Trinity is found in the New Testament, but not in the Old Testament. It's at this point that God reveals it. Now, it's not that God can't tell us more information. He can't tell us something new. So in principle, that's not a problem on that level. Anything God says additionally is potentially not just illuminating, giving us more details about a truth we already know. He could also just add to the pile of truths that we know. But is that the case? One of the things I was struck with as I was reading the Bible is how often the New Testament writers either took for granted the deity of Christ, or they spoke of him as God or of the Spirit as God by means of the Old Testament. The New Testament writers don't seem to think this is something new, but this is something that they already had in their Old Testament. So let me give you an example of places where they just assume it. One of my favorite texts, probably a loved text by many of you, is Philippians 2. Many people turn there when they're trying to argue for the deity of Christ. So this is the text where Paul says, though existing in the form of God, he did not consider that equality. He was equal with God because of this. He exists in the form of God. He didn't consider that equality something to be used to his own advantage, but humbled himself, taking the form of a servant, and so forth. And then it talks about him being highly exalted and given the divine name. He's ascribed deity. Well, that text that we often turn to prove the deity of Christ, that's not what Paul's doing. Now, he is speaking of Christ as God there, but Paul's trying to make a different point. In the context, Paul's dealing with the strife that was existing in the Philippian church. Certain people were not recognizing the rights of others or honoring others or serving others. And so Paul's exhorting them to humility of mind. And he says to these people, let this mind be in you that was also in Christ. Although existing in the form of God, he didn't consider equality. He's appealing to this that they already accept. It's already a firmly held belief in order to inculcate in them this other attitude, right? So Paul's not arguing for Christ's deity. He's taking it as a given. And it's the platform for his moral exhortation. Well, it's not just in New Testament epistles that you get that. Sometimes you get it in some surprising ways. Perhaps this example that I'll give will be a new way of seeing this, and I'll press this a little bit more as we go along. But at Christ's trial, are the religious leaders upset that Jesus is teaching that there's another person who is God? Or is their problem Jesus claiming to be that other person? Remember, at the trial of Christ, the high priest said, are you the Christ, the Son of the living God? He doesn't say, do you believe there is such a person? Do you believe God has a son? He's saying, are you him? Their problem is this man from Galilee was claiming to be that figure. Now, there's a whole host of things that go along with this I'd love to get into. I'd never get to all that I need to just with respect to the Trinity in the Bible. But one thing I'll say briefly is there's a construction in Greek when it says, for example, at the beginning of the Gospel of Mark, it says, the beginning of the Gospel of Jesus Christ, the Son of God. It's an appositional construction, and that basically means that one term helps to identify what's meant by the first term. And there are different kinds of appositional constructions. So, in other words, Jesus Christ and Son of God, these two terms are related. One is helping to explain the first. The way some people do is they move in the direction of, okay, so Son of God just means Christ. So whatever you think Christ means, anointed one and so forth. But it's actually the opposite. It's saying he's the Christ in this sense. He's the Son of God. In other words, so there were various conceptions in Judaism of, they had different messiahs in mind. Some thought that there was just one and he would be all these things. Others thought that there's a Messiah of David, Messiah of Aaron, Messiah of Joseph, because they're trying to account for what looked to them like inconsistencies. So in the Talmud, for example, it says somebody asks, how will the Messiah come? And then some say, well, if Israel is repentant, then he'll come lowly and riding on a donkey. But if Israel's not repentant, he'll come riding the clouds, right? So there's two different texts that they're looking at, Zechariah 9 and Daniel 7. They don't see how these can both be true of the same individual. So they think these are different messiahs. Well, they also had a clear conception of a Messiah who's a heavenly person, because there are numerous texts that speak to someone who far outstrips an ordinary human being. In fact, Daniel was one of those texts. Daniel, in the another Talmudic reference, has one of the foremost rabbis of the ancient period, Rabbi Akiva, being rebuked by other rabbis. Now, this is striking because Akiva is huge in rabbinic literature. Ask any rabbinic Jew, post-Christian Jew, what they think of Akiva, and you're going to get an earful that he's a giant. Well, the question was raised in Akiva's presence, who are these thrones for? And when in Daniel, when it says the thrones were set in heaven, and then he says one for the Ancient of Days and one for the Messiah. And then the people there tear their clothes and they say blasphemy, because they recognize you have to understand a bunch of things that are behind this. One is, in the rabbinic mind, nobody sits in heaven except for God. The angels are always portrayed as standing. And so the idea that there's another person who's going to sit struck them as blasphemous. But what do you do with this text? Well, the way the other rabbi said Akiva should have responded is to say, one throne is for justice and one throne is for mercy. So these are just different thrones representing different attributes of God. But Akiva gives the Christian answer, and he's rebuked for it. And it's considered blasphemy. He's asserting the divinity of the Messiah. So this is the idea in the New Testament often of the Messiah, that he's a divine figure. He's a heavenly figure. And this is why the high priest is so upset and why they charge Jesus with blasphemy. But at no point are they questioning the ability or the propriety of somebody as a Jew affirming more than one divine person. That wasn't something that was ruled out of court. So these sorts of things strike me as I was reading the Bible, and I'm hearing people in my early days attack the doctrine of the Trinity. I'm thinking, it's not only in the Bible, it's something that the New Testament writers seem to think is in perfect accord with the Old Testament. And I just scratched the surface. Think about 1 Corinthians 10, one of my, I guess all these I keep saying are my favorite texts. I'll just state this at the outset. Any text I quote now is going to be a favorite text. But in 1 Corinthians 10, Paul says, I don't want you to be unaware, brothers, that our fathers were all under the cloud and all passed through the sea. And all were baptized into Moses in the cloud and in the sea, and all ate the same spiritual food, and all drank the same spiritual drink. For they drank from the spiritual rock that followed them, and the rock was Christ. Now, what some people think is going on here is that Paul is taking, remember, Moses struck a rock and water gushed forth. They think that Paul is taking that rock and using it as a type. It's a type of Jesus. It points forward to Jesus. But that's not what Paul was doing. I can tell you, and if you want to ask me more about this and explain it more later, if Paul was saying that, he would have used different terms here. He would have said the rock is Christ. If it represents Jesus, then he would say it is Christ. Right? When somebody is a type or something is a type, it says this is that. That's the language. That's how you do that. For example, when Paul uses Hagar and Sarah as allegories, he uses the present tense to communicate that. But here, Paul says that rock was Christ. That's not how you would speak if it was simply a type. Besides that, he speaks here of a spiritual rock. He's cluing you in. It's not that rock. It's some other rock was following them. A rock was following them. Well, when you go back to the Old Testament, who was following the Israelites? Who's going before and behind them? Who's providing for them? In fact, in Deuteronomy 32, you have a song of Moses. There are two songs known that are attributed to Moses, the Song of the Sea in Exodus 15, and then Deuteronomy 32, which is a pretty frightening song in a sense. In 31, it says, teach this song to the Israelites. It's going to be a testimony against them in the latter days when they rebel against me, and I turn my face from them, and I punish them, and so forth. Imagine here, learn this song. This song, every time you sing it, it's going to remind you that you're going to rebel against God, and he's going to discipline you for it, and it's not going to be pretty. How excited would you be every time you sang that song? Well, that's what Israel was told. Well, throughout that song, God repeatedly calls himself the rock. He is their rock. And the reason he's going to discipline them in the future is because they turn to others as rocks. And he's going to say to them in the future, where is your rock? Where's your rock to help you now? So repeatedly, he's called the rock there. And in that context, he's telling them, look, I led you out of Egypt. I was with you in the wilderness. I took care of you. I provided for you. That's who Paul is saying Jesus is. In fact, if you go down in 1 Corinthians 10, notice what it says. And some of your translations may read a little differently here. But in the ESV, it says, we must not put Christ to the test as some of them did and were destroyed by serpents. Here it says that it was Christ in the wilderness who sent fiery serpents among them. So again, you have a reference in the New Testament to Christ in the Old. This happens over and over again. In Hebrews 11, you don't have to turn there. You can. In Hebrews 11, it mentions Moses. He was raised as Pharaoh's grandson, right? The Pharaoh's daughter got him and took him in and took care of him. So he's raised as Pharaoh's grandson, but he eventually in life chooses to identify with the Israelites. But how does Paul, or the author of Hebrews, put it? The author of Hebrews puts it this way. He says he's chose to suffer the reproach of Christ rather than enjoy all the treasures of Egypt and suffer affliction with the people of God. Moses chose to endure the reproach of Christ. He identifies with Christ and his people and took all that came along with that. How did he do that? Jesus doesn't come until the New Testament, right? Jesus isn't God. He wasn't declared to be God until the Council of Nicaea, right? So this sort of thing happens if you pay attention all over the Bible, all over the New Testament. You have not only Hebrews, but Jude. Jude 1, well, there's only one chapter. But in Jude 1, it mentions that there are certain unprincipled men who deny our only master and Lord. Our only master and Lord. And then it says, there it says, our only master and Lord, Jesus Christ. So it says he's our only master and Lord. And then it says immediately after that, the Lord led a people out of Egypt and later destroyed those who didn't believe. Now, I think the original reading, and this is perhaps in your translations, if you look at Jude 1:5, the original reading says Jesus led a people out of Egypt. And what happened was some later scribes looking at this think, well, it seems odd. So most critical scholars will say that the oldest reading, the best attested reading is Jesus. And so it's usually found in all the critical texts, the texts that show the variants and that sort of thing. They all seem to think this is the preferred reading. And that's why it's in reading, or it's in the ESV, I believe. I didn't even look. Okay, so ESV, it's in a lot of the standard translations. But my point, notice, even without that, the context says that unprincipled men, lawless men, have denied our only master and Lord, Jesus Christ. And then he says, the Lord led a people out of Egypt and later destroyed those who didn't believe. Contextually, it has to be Jesus. You can't get around it. So the New Testament authors do this all the time. But guess who else does this? Jesus does it. He does it all the time. You'll be familiar with this example, but I always like to go to it because there's so much more than is often seen. But in John chapter 8, remember that the Jews object to the things Jesus is saying, and they say, you're not yet 50 years old and you've seen Abraham? And then he says, before Abraham was, I am. Right? It's literally, before Abraham became, I am. That's the exact grammar there. And this is important because at the beginning of the gospel, John has already set this language up. In the beginning was the Word. And then it says in verse 3, all things became through him. And so when you see Jesus saying, Abraham, before Abraham became, I am, he's identifying himself as the Word that John introduced in the prologue. But look at the context of this. Way back in the context, Jesus has already been pointing in this direction. And this is what people miss that is to me so profound. Jesus says in, I'll start in verse 31. Jesus said to the Jews who had believed him, if you abide in my word, you are truly my disciples, and you'll know the truth, and the truth will set you free. They answered, we are offspring of Abraham and have never been enslaved to anyone. How is it that you say you will become free? Now, there's a problem here. These Jews are not showing themselves already to be very good descendants of Abraham. The Israelites are, by definition, that group of people who were delivered from slavery. They're taught to say in the Ten Commandments, I'm the Lord your God who delivered you out of the house of bondage. And here they are claiming to be Abraham's descendants, but Abraham's descendants, Abraham was told, your descendants will be slaves in a land, and I'll deliver them. So they're fundamentally denying or going in the face of the Old Testament. Who are you to say we need to be made free? So there's already a problem. But in verse 34, it says, Jesus answered them, truly, truly, I say to you, everyone who practices sin is a slave of sin. So he's going beyond just outward bondage. The slave does not remain in the house forever. The son remains forever. So if the son sets you free, you will be free indeed. So here he's claiming to be able to deliver from spiritual bondage. That's already an astounding claim. But then he says this, I know that you are offspring of Abraham, yet you seek to kill me because my word finds no place in you. Now, here you should pause and think about this. What is it that Jesus is suggesting is so problematic here? I know that you are children of Abraham, yet. When he says yet, he's saying these two things don't comport. There's a problem here. If you're Abraham's children, in other words, you shouldn't be resisting my word. You should accept my word. Somehow, the word of Christ being received marks one off as a child of Abraham. But why? What does Christ have to do with Abraham? We keep going in verse 38. I speak of what I have seen with my father, and you do what you've heard from your father. Now, at this point, they don't know who he means when he refers to the father. You know, in fact, they'll say this later in the context, but we know what he means. But he goes on, they answered him, or they go on, Abraham is our father. Jesus said to them, now he just challenges their claims to Abraham. He's affirmed it in a sense a moment ago, obviously biologically, but he says, if you were Abraham's children, you would be doing the works of Abraham did. But now you seek to kill me, a man who has told you the truth that I heard from God. This is not what Abraham did. Now, again, the way people read this is all too casually. They read this as Jesus just saying Abraham was a certain sort of character. When he met people, he was hospitable, and he certainly was. And so when you're not hospitable towards me, you don't receive me, you reject me, you're not being like Abraham in this very general sense. But the word this in the Greek text, it's the pronoun this, it points back to something. You're supposed to look for an antecedent. What is it that Jesus is pointing to when he says, this Abraham did not do? He's pointing to the statement about them trying to kill him. Verse 40, you now seek to kill me, a man who's told you the truth that I heard from God. This is not what Abraham did. In other words, Abraham did not try to kill me. That's the point of this, right? That's why eventually the Jews are like, wait a minute. This guy's claiming to know Abraham. That's why you get to where you do in at the end of the chapter in verse 58. Who do you think you are? Right? So Jesus is claiming to be somebody that was there that knew Abraham. Well, I've spent a good bit of time in the New Testament. There's no end of things that can be pointed out there. But this just gets you into the idea that, okay, well, then this is an Old Testament thing from the perspective of the New Testament writers. So can we go to the Old Testament and see this? Well, go to Genesis 18, because this is just one of many, but it's one that I think Jesus actually had in view when he's talking about Abraham knowing him. In Genesis 18, you have the account of three men appearing to Abraham. And you've probably heard somebody say, Muslims are famous for saying that God can't enter into his creation. And I always think, well, that's just foolish. Imagine somebody building a house that they aren't able to access, right? A house without doors and windows? What kind of a God is that? He's like this, I walk out of my house all the time without my keys. I mean, it's almost a daily experience. Can you imagine God that, obviously I'm not your God. But it's like, this is the Islamic deity. He's a bumbling absentee landlord or something. But I hear this all the time. God can't enter into his creation. When I go to the Old Testament, it's like, well, he seems to be here more often than not. Really, you turn the pages in Genesis and the Lord's showing up at every turn. He doesn't seem to have an inability to enter into creation. Certainly he's infinite, but being infinite means he's capable of doing just that sort of thing that people say he can't. But in Genesis 18, it says the Lord appeared to him, meaning Abram, by the oaks of Mamre as he sat at the door of his tent in the heat of the day. He lifted up his eyes and looked, and behold, three men were standing in front of him. When he saw them, he ran from the tent door to meet them and bowed himself to the earth and said, O Lord, if I found favor in your sight, do not pass by your servant. Let a little water be brought and wash your feet and rest yourselves under the tree while I bring a morsel of bread. And then it goes on. If you look, let's say just for one example, verses 9 and 10, they said to him, where is Sarah, your wife? And he said, she is in the tent. Then the Lord said, I will surely return to you about this time next year, and Sarah, your wife, will have a son. So this tells you one of the main reasons why God was appearing to Abraham and Sarah was to announce to them the coming birth of Isaac, the long-awaited birth of the promised seed that would bring blessing to the entire world. Now, I always like to ask this question. In light of that verse that I just read, what do you think Abraham and Sarah were looking forward to next year? Isaac, everybody? Now I don't disagree with you all, but I'm going to read the verse again, and you're going to, I hope, and I think you're going to see, wait a minute. Along with that, there's something more. This is what he said. The Lord said, I will surely return to you about this time next year, and Sarah, your wife, will have a son. Now, what do you think they're looking forward to? In addition to Isaac coming, the Lord's going to return. So they're looking forward to the return of the Lord. Here, God has appeared to them in the flesh, and now he's talking about his promised return. And this promised return coincides with the birth of this promised son. It's a beautiful picture. So Abraham is looking forward to this day, right? Do you know where I'm going with this? Abraham's looking forward to this day. His wife initially laughs in the tent. Remember, she laughs, but this is a laughter of unbelief. She's doubtful. I mean, this person's appeared in human form. At what point does she know it's the Lord? But this claim is made, and she's past the age of childbearing, so this causes laughter. Well, later when you go to Genesis 21 and she has Isaac, she actually names him. Her laughter turns to joy, basically, and she names him Isaac, which means laughter or joy, because of this. So it's no longer a laughter of unbelief, but a response of faith. So here's this promise of the return of the Lord coinciding with the birth of this son. They looked forward to this, and on this occasion they rejoiced. You remember what Jesus said in John 8? He said, your father Abraham rejoiced to see my day. He saw it and was glad. He speaks of it as past tense. It was a day in the past. Abraham saw his day, a day that Abraham looked forward to. So Jesus is alluding to this account, and there's a whole lot more that goes into this. But there's another reason the Lord appeared on this occasion. He appeared to announce the coming birth of Isaac, coinciding with his return, but he also came to inspect Sodom and Gomorrah. The outcry had come up to heaven, and so he's going to go in person and survey it. Not, of course, that he needs to, but the whole idea. There's a whole host of things behind this that make it important. But we have to gloss over some of that. As you look at this, though, he stays behind. He talks to Abraham. He announces what he's going to do, and then Abraham begins to petition God not to destroy the city. If there are 50 righteous in the city, if there are 40, if there are 30, you all know the prayer, the intercession there. Well, but the whole point that you have to see is the Lord has told him he's going down into Sodom. Now, while he stays behind to have this conversation with Abraham, the other two men left, and we're told explicitly in 19:1 they were angels. Okay, so these two other figures, by the way, think of the imagery. Here you have the Lord with two angels. To me, it always evokes the imagery of the ark. Remember the two angels on the ark and the Lord dwelling between them. If you look at John 20, there's this, when they look in the tomb, remember, Jesus was laid on a flat slab, right? So in John's account, it mentions that there were two angels in the tomb, one at the head and the other at the feet. So you have this flat slab where the body of Jesus was, flanked by two angels on either side. Again, a picture of the ark and the mercy seat and where the blood of the sacrifice was placed. So you get this sort of thing all over the place. So these two angels go into Sodom and Gomorrah. The Lord stays behind, but he tells Abraham he's going after them, but he's staying behind to talk to Abraham. Well, when you get to chapter 19, the two angels get Lot and his daughters, and they're taking them out of the city, as well as the wife who turns back and is turned to a pillar of salt. But look at what happens in 1924. So the Lord is on earth in human form. In verse 24, it says this: "Then the Lord rained on Sodom and Gomorrah sulfur and fire from the Lord out of heaven." The Lord on earth in human form rained fire from the Lord from heaven. You have two persons here, one on earth in human form, the other who is in heaven, one of whom is raining the fire from the other. Remember, Jesus said that the final judgment will be just like what happened to Sodom and Gomorrah. He mentions the Son of Man coming, and the New Testament fills this out. It talks about him coming with fire and so forth. Here you have an anticipation of that. You have a divine person in human form descending, and he brings the fire with him, as it were. And he says it'll be just like that on the final day. In fact, Jude tells us that this was all a picture. It was all a picture of the eternal judgment that the wicked will endure. So here's one of just scores of examples. What I'm doing is not even trying to get 25% into the evidence of the Old Testament, but I'm hoping that this is the sort of thing that seeing it once, you're then able to see other instances of it. But I won't stop here. I think I was told, okay, I got at least 5 more minutes. So let's choose one more. If you go back to Genesis 16, you have the first instance of a mention of the angel of the Lord. Now, I mentioned the angels that were with the Lord at Sodom, but in that case, they were quite obviously ordinary angels. The term angel, though, itself doesn't necessarily refer to what we ordinarily mean by an angelic being. The word angel in Hebrew is the word for messenger. In fact, the word angel is not a translation. It's a transliteration from Greek. So the Greek word is angelos, and that means we just take the sound from one language and put it into ours. But if we translated it, it would be messenger. So when it says, sometimes they do translate it, but that obscures then that it's the same word being used in all these cases. So, for example, when John the Baptist comes, he's a messenger sent by God to prepare the way for Jesus. He's called an angel. Anybody reading it in Greek would see angel there. They don't think this means one of the seraphim or cherubim or any of the angelic orders. Nobody even bats an eye that reads Greek and Hebrew. And so it's the same thing in Hebrew. In Hebrew, the term messenger is used for human beings more often than anything else. 50% of the time it's used for human beings. Jacob sent messengers ahead of him to Esau. It's angels. In fact, there's a bunch of play on the word there in Genesis 30 or 32. It's where it mentions that he saw angels of God ascending and descending there. And then it mentions that he sends angels to his brother Esau. And then he talks about this being two camps. There's his camp and God's camp, the angels, right? So there's his messengers and God's messengers. And then he splits his camp into two. And you know, I mean, there's a bunch of stuff going on there. And so he calls it Mahanaim, two tents or camps. Or so you have the term angel used, and some people just immediately assume creature. But it's not telling you what kind of being this is. It's just identifying them by their function. They give messages. So you can't assume when you see the word angel that it's always a creature. Well, whenever you see the full phrase, the angel of the Lord, I can tell you it's never a creature. So watch what happens in Genesis 16, verse 7. It says, the angel of the Lord found her by a spring of water in the wilderness, the spring on the way to Shur. And he said, Hagar, servant of Sarai, where have you come from and where are you going? Now, how does the angel identify himself to Hagar here? This is important. He doesn't, right? He doesn't tell her who he is. He just talks to her. And he calls her by name. I love this. Here's this woman that he meets by a well, by the way. Meets this woman by a well and he calls her by name. Well, he doesn't tell her who he is. So if she's going to know who he is, it's going to have to be discerned from something that happens. As we read in the context, she says to him, I'm fleeing from my mistress Sarai. Then it says, the angel of the Lord said to her. Now remember, this is the narrator calling him the angel of the Lord. It's not him telling her that's who he is. So all she has to go on is the way he's talking and the way he's acting. The angel of the Lord said to her, return to your mistress and submit to her. So now this person who knows her by name presumes to tell her what to do. Go submit to your mistress, Sarai. Then, verse 10, the angel of the Lord also said to her, I will surely multiply your offspring so that they will be, so that they cannot be numbered for multitude. This is the same promise God made to Abraham. So here, this angel of the Lord, this figure, unidentified, presumes to tell her what to do, knows her by name, and tells her he's going to multiply her descendants. Verse 11, the angel of the Lord said to her, behold, you're pregnant and shall bear a son. He knows she's pregnant without ultrasound. You shall call his name Ishmael. He presumes to tell her what to name him, right? Now, but notice this, because the Lord has listened to your affliction. Now he talks about the Lord in the third person. Well, whereas he has been talking all along as if he is the Lord. So is he the Lord or is the Lord another? Well, yes, that's the whole point. Go on, verse 12. He shall be a wild donkey of a man. This is the supposed ancestor of Muhammad, right? That's what they claim. He shall be a wild donkey of a man, his hand against everyone, and everyone's hand against him, and he shall dwell over against all his kinsmen. But then verse 13. So she called the name of the Lord who spoke to her, you are a God of seeing. Who spoke to her? The angel of the Lord, right? She says God. Moses calls him Lord. She called the name of the Lord who spoke to her. That's Moses, the narrator. He's setting up her quote. She called the name of the Lord who spoke to her. That's Lord in all caps. That means that's the covenant name of God. She called him God. Moses calls him Lord. And by the way, it goes on to say, for truly I've seen him who looks after me. The literal Hebrew says she has seen his back, his receding part. It's the same language used in Exodus when Moses says, show me your glory. And he says, nobody can see my glory and live, Moses, but I'll put you in the cleft of a rock and I'll pass by and you'll see my back, or the receding effects of my presence. So there's a connection here. There's numerous connections here. I wish I could keep going, but you can pick my brain afterwards. I'm happy to do that. There's so much I haven't said, but I haven't even talked about the Spirit, but the Spirit is present throughout the Old Testament. The same things I've done here, you can do with the Spirit. The Spirit's already there in Genesis 1, 2. He's brooding over the surface of the waters. Psalm 104:30 says the Spirit created and preserves things. Job 33 says the Spirit of God made me. The Spirit's all over the Old Testament. So this is a full Bible truth. And it's not just in the whole Bible, it's throughout the whole Bible. So I'll conclude with that, or questions and answers, I guess. Question is, do we have any questions?
I have a question. I've heard it often said that the word Elohim is a plural in Genesis, especially is where I usually think of it. But is that a good case to use for the Trinity argument or not? Because I've never seen it as necessarily a positive one, not a bad one, but would you say it's a good or bad case?
Yeah, so I wouldn't use it. It's not though that there's not potentially something interesting about it. So what he's referring to is, so for example, in Genesis 1:1, it says, Bereshit bara Elohim. In Hebrew, a noun with the im ending, yod mem ending, is a plural technically. But in the Hebrew language, verbs also have an embedded subject. And so the verb will be either singular or plural. And that indicates that the noun that's used in connection with it, it's governed by that, right? So while the word God in Hebrew is plural when used for our God, Elohim, the word for created is he created. So it's singular. So you have, that's how it happens all the time. And that's, you can do that with nouns in Hebrew, and it's not just for God. Sometimes it's other things. And so it's not that I would say, oh, here you go. The word for God is plural, therefore it's the Trinity. However, I do find something interesting about it. The nations around Israel were all polytheistic. And they referred to the gods. They talked about the Elohim. But when they wanted to talk about one of the gods, they just called it an El or Eloah or by some singular form. So it's striking to me that the Israelites would choose by far to use a plural term for God when they're opposing polytheism. So why do they choose this term when there are perfectly good singular terms that they could use? So I just find that really striking. But what's true of nouns, that you can have a plural used with a singular verb and it not mean that there's a plural subject, is not true in the case of pronouns and verbs. So when you get to verse 26 of Genesis and it says, let us make man, that's a whole different thing. There is really a plurality of personal subjects that are being addressed there. That's grammatically, you can't say that's just a plural of majesty or something like that. That doesn't work. So I find in Elohim, the plural, intriguing, but I wouldn't use it as a knockdown, drag out argument.
Okay. Thank you.
Yeah.
I've been studying the book of Hebrews in the long term. And is it of your, I don't know if anyone knows the answer 100%, but what do you think about Melchizedek being Jesus Christ? Yay or nay?
Yeah. So the issue is, some will wonder, is Melchizedek a type of Jesus, a picture of Jesus in advance, or is he actually Jesus pre-incarnate? My position is that it's a type of Jesus in this case. Not that there's any problem with Jesus appearing in the Old Testament. Obviously not after what I just said. He's all over the place. But in this case, I think it's a type. What's happening is the Spirit superintending the writing of Scripture moves the author to include and exclude what he wants. And that creates a certain literary picture, right? So we all tell stories, and we might give additional details to one person than we give to another. And a lot of that's determined by what we're trying to highlight. What are we trying to bring out to this person? You know, parents might talk about what happened at the store and want to focus on how Johnny was acting or something like that. And so they don't say anything about Susie, who's with them. You know, they're highlighting something. Well, what's interesting to a Jewish audience is, here's Melchizedek being portrayed as a priest. Well, a person's a priest based on his pedigree. You can't be a priest without being in that hereditary line. But nothing's said about Melchizedek's parents. It's just not mentioned. And so it leaves this impression of a priest without ancestry. And so that raises all sorts of questions. So the author of Hebrews is playing off of this, and he's saying all of this is a picture of Jesus. Without father, without mother, without end of days, without end of life, he remains a priest forever after the order of Melchizedek. So he's saying it's an order, it's a priesthood, but it's typified by Melchizedek in these ways. And we could talk more about it too, if you want.
Yeah, so my question, just asking for clarification on Isaiah 9:6, where it attributes names to the Son who will be given, mighty God, wonderful counselor, Prince of Peace, everlasting Father. So obviously the Son isn't the Father.
Yeah.
What's the explanation for that? Just because on the surface level, it's like, oh, are you attributing the name, the Father, to the Son?
Yeah. So number one, a term like father is a relational term, right? It means you are something to something. You're the father of, and the correlative of that is son, right? So you have a father, you have a son. These are relational terms. Here's why this is important, because a person is a father in relation to a son. A son is a son in relation to a father. A person is not a father in relation to himself, right? You are a father to someone, not to yourself. You're a son of someone, not of yourself. So even if we say, here's Jesus being called the Father, he's not being called his Father. He's not being called God the Father. Now, there's more to this, but I'm just saying at no point do you have Jesus identifying himself as his own Father. But does that preclude Jesus being a Father in other ways? Paul speaks of being certain people's Father in the gospel, meaning that he proclaimed the gospel to them, they became believers. Jesus says in Mark 2, when he heals the man's son, your sins are forgiven you. Calls him son. So there's certainly this sense in which Jesus relates to us in this way, but he at no point is saying he's God the Father. Now, here in Isaiah 9:6, it's the syntax is actually different in Hebrew. It says Aviad. Av is the word for father, and Ad is the word for everlastingness or eternity or something along those lines. What it's saying is he's the father of eternity, the father of everlastingness. In Hebrew idiom, when somebody's called the father of something, it means they possess that. If it's an abstract thing, it means they possess that quality. So when Satan's called the father of lies, it doesn't mean he has little children called lies, right? It means that he's a liar. If somebody's called the father of strength, it means he's strong. So Jesus is called the father of eternity, the father of everlastingness. It means he's eternal. And so, and besides that, okay, yeah. So that's the basic answer.
Yeah, makes sense. Thank you.
Yeah. 2 more minutes. I'll be quick.
This is probably going to be redundant, but I have some acquaintances and friends that have kind of dabbled in modalism. What do you think is the strongest and most concise, destruction of modalism?
Yeah, so I have debates with modalists online. One was with Stacy Turville.
Yeah.
You seen that?
Yeah, he didn't offer much.
Yeah. So one thing is just pay attention to. So what the modalist will try to do whenever you have a distinction between Father and Son, they'll say it's a distinction between Christ's human nature and divine nature. We obviously believe he has 2 natures, deity and humanity, but these aren't Father. These natures are not the Father and the Son. It's the Son who has 2 natures, the Son of the Father, right? So anytime you show a distinction, Jesus talking to the Father, they'll say, oh, that's just the human nature, the divine nature. But Jesus uses personal terms in all of this. He says, you, Father, right? Glorify me. He's not talking to merely his other nature. He's using personal pronouns. It's one person talking to another. And so, and along with this, you get terms like also and another and other and besides and with, right? I'm with the Father. The Father's always with me. But one text that I think is great is John 8, when Jesus says something about himself and the Jews say, you're testifying about yourself. Your testimony is not true. And Jesus says, well, even if I was testifying about myself by myself, my testimony would be true because I know where I came from and where I'm going. But then he says, it's written in your law, the testimony of 2 men is true, 2 witnesses. He says, I am one witness, my Father is the other. Now imagine, so here, I'll tell you the answer because you'll hear this from them. what they'll usually say is, well, that's his human nature and his divine nature, right? Now imagine going into court, Judge, I've got two witnesses, right? I've got two witnesses here, my body and my soul, right? They both testify, so I outnumber the opposition. You know, I had a guy, I forget what he was saying. He was acting like, anyways, I said, you know, might as well start, I forget exactly what he said, but I was like, you might as well start also counting the hairs on your head, right? They're all witnesses too. So I've got, you know, I don't know, 100,000 witnesses. I don't know how many hairs I got. But anyways, that's one of my favorite texts on
Thank you.
that.
All right, in your 15 seconds left, what are the Jews anticipating since they've rejected the Messiah? What is the person that they are waiting for, and is it consistent with the New Testament revelation of Jesus Christ?
So they're all over the map. Obviously, secular Jews are one thing, not really expecting anything. But typically, they just think of, well, if you go back to somebody like Maimonides, medieval rabbis, they actually, it's really fascinating. They say that Jesus actually served a purpose in God's providence. He introduced the notion of monotheism to the Gentiles and the morality of the Bible. But that's all just paving the way for the true Messiah. So when the true Messiah comes, we're already used to some of these concepts, and now it's going to be easier to embrace this figure. But really, all he's expected to do is establish Jewish hegemony over there and throw off all. It's just basically some of the same stuff you get in the Gospels, where he's supposed to just kick the Romans out and make them the leaders in their own country. So that's part of it, but they're all over the map. There's a lot of disagreement among them, but it's never, at this point in the game, it's never anything more than just a man who's like a political figure. Maybe he has some religious usefulness. Some will talk about him having special insights into the Torah or something like that, but nothing much to speak of. Some don't really have a concept of a personal Messiah, but just a messianic period of peace and so forth. All right, I was given you're done, the Muslim.